I'm David Ledenhawk, that's Karl Marx, and this is Dave's Film Faves. Hi, I'm not sure how long Carl's going to stay in this video, but he just wanted to sit next to me while I was setting up the tripod. So here we go. It's Halloween as I record this, and so it's time for the last of the 4 promised Dave's Film Faves for this month where I talk about horror movies. So I decided to dig a little deeper. Not as far as obscurity, because this one is actually pretty well known, but as far as age of the movies. This one came out in 1980, and it's one of the more extreme ones that's known, and that is, of course, Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust. Bye, Carl. He must have heard about the animal cruelty in the movie and decided to go to his cat tree. So what can I really say about Cannibal Holocaust that hasn't been said already? This is a film that I don't recommend to most people. They definitely have to like horror films and extreme horror films and have a strong stomach, because this film does have actual on-camera depictions of violence against animals. Some DVD copies, I'm not sure if mine does because I haven't actually watched it in a while, do have an animal cruelty-free version where it skips over those scenes, and you don't really have to watch those scenes. What those scenes do in the film, and I do consider those scenes unethical, so I'm glad that doesn't happen in more films, and even the director has said it was a mistake to include them. By having very real on-camera violence against animals, and then you have the fake staged violence against people, it makes the real violence sort of tricks your brain into thinking the later violence against people is real. Plus, the film is one of the earliest examples of the found footage genre, and a less annoying version of it because it's not all shaky handheld camera kind of stuff. It's about a documentary film crew. I guess I should talk a little bit about what the plot of this film is. So, a documentary film crew goes into the rainforest to film indigenous tribes, and they disappear. Okay? So, a New York University anthropologist, I believe his character's name is Harold Monroe. He's the only character name I'm going to even vaguely remember about this movie, by the way. He's set to go and search to find out what happened to them. So he ends up going to the rainforest. Various events happen, which lead him to be brought to the tribe that the earlier documentary film crew fell upon. And they're initially wary and suspicious of him, but he takes part in some of their rituals, and he treats them with respect. And at that point, they sort of reward him for his respect and kindness with the film canisters that the documentary film crew shot before they disappeared. And he does end up finding the remains of them. And this is a cannibal tribe, so he assumes they've been eaten, but he doesn't know what the situation for that was. So he gets back to New York, and he's given early access to view some of this footage because a company wants to take the footage and edit it together and release it on television or something. And he's like, no, you can't show this, just destroy the footage. And the company's like, well, no, we can make money off of this, we should screen it and everything, it's a good story. And he's like, just watch the whole movie. And then the second half of the film, because that first half of the film, admittedly, it's pretty slow, and you don't really know where the film exactly is going. It can even be very tedious at times. And then the second half of the film is what the missing documentary film crew shot. And they were shooting a film within a film called The Green Inferno, which would later, that title later became a movie that Eli Roth made. That's sort of a throwback to movies like Cannibal Holocaust and other stuff like Cannibal Ferox and some others. This was sort of its own little mini subgenre around like the 80s, and they're mostly Italian films. This is an Italian film, but it was shot in English to make it more palatable to world audiences. So we find out that the film crew that disappeared, they were sort of unethical journalists. They would often stage certain things to make their footage more exciting, and they would exploit people. One of the things we see early on is that they make sure that some tribes people have to stay in a burning hut so they can film like them dying and stuff to get better footage when they could have easily just saved them and let them go. So we know that these aren't good people. I believe there's 5 of them, 4 men and 1 woman. The woman, she seems to be the most ethical of them, but still not completely ethical, whereas all the other ones don't seem to have any compunctions about their actions. And I'm not going to go into details because describing a list of cruel acts committed by and upon these people is not making for the best video, and you can just watch the film for those. In fact, not knowing exactly what's going to happen, even if you've seen some of the more iconic imagery, like the woman impaled on the spike and things like that, it's better if it happens sort of as a surprise, because this film is partially about the shock factor, especially when you first see it. So I don't want to ruin that, but they're not good people. They don't treat the indigenous people well, for lack of a better term, and they are suitably punished for it. And yeah, and then we get the footage, and eventually, when we get back, Monroe convinces the people to like burn the remaining film and stuff. So this film operates on 2 levels. There's the story level, surface level, which is mostly about like shock factor, about the violence that is committed both to and by the documentary film crew. They're horrendous people. The indigenous people are not portrayed in the most culturally sensitive way, to put it mildly. It's a very Western-centric view of indigenous peoples. It's not a realistic depiction, even of like cannibalistic tribes or anything like that. So a lot of it is about sort of just cruel people doing cruel things and then having bad things done to them as, turnabout is fair play. And so a lot of the people who first come to this movie, once they hear about it, they're viewing it as sort of an endurance test. And there are movies like that. I mean, I covered Martyrs, which is a newer, I guess, version of that, if people can, handle watching it, if they can stand watching it. A Serbian film comes to mind. It's a movie I like, and also has deeper stuff beneath all the shock value. And I guess to a lesser extent you get the movies like the Hostel movies and stuff, which are probably stronger than the average filmgoer, even the average horror filmgoer would see, but very tame for somebody who sees a lot of horror movies, especially extreme horror movies that were made around like the 70s and 80s. They don't make them like that anymore. So, if you want to go even more recent, The Bunny Game, which is, that one's less about on-screen violence and more about a lot of like sound design, much like the dinner scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, imagine the dinner scene of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre film length, and that's The Bunny Game. So there's that. It's like, it's sort of a, did I see this movie because it's so controversial and, extreme, and, did I have to cover my eyes, did I vomit? It's one of those movies, like, did you make it through it? You should get that t-shirt, I survived Cannibal Holocaust or something. But there is social commentary in the film, as the best horror movies usually do. One of my favorite things about the horror genre is that it's a genre where political and social messages can be given, and the film usually isn't attacked for being too preachy, and that's because the violence on the surface is so attention-grabbing that most people don't see past that. So it's like most people don't see that the Hostel movies are an attack on global capitalism and specifically an attack on the Bush administration. Or a lot of people don't want to look at the Saw films as being sort of a philosophical argument, even though a lot of the philosophy of those movies is on the surface, granted. Or they don't want to see Last House on the Left as a commentary on the Vietnam War. They just want to see, the murder, the rape, and the gore, and all that stuff. And it's like, well, obviously that's just a cruel piece of cinema. That's not saying anything. It's just violence for violence sake so that gorehounds can jack off in their basements. But they But because the plebeians won't see past that level, it has more freedom to say stronger things than, say, Suburbicon or something, where it's going to be preachy if it tries to say something, especially if it tries to say it on an obvious level where the average person who doesn't write, essays on film is going to get. So, but it's a little fairly easy to see what the message of this movie is. I mean, there's essentially two main parts. One part is about journalistic standards. The director had said that there was footage that he believed was sort of shot or partially staged, news footage at the time, contemporaneous footage, and he believes the media was being exploitative in showing it that way, and that they were going so far as to stage things for better footage. So it's about sort of journalistic ethics. So he was exploring that with the documentary film crew that disappears, and how they're basically making their own snuff films, or at least allowing snuff films to happen before their cameras so that they have better footage that they can then sell. That's sort of mondo journalism of the time. And then the other part of it is just sort of cultural commentary about imperialism, how the Westerners in the film, and the character, while the actors they're American, they're Italian, they're a bunch of different nationalities, but inside the film they are American characters, and how like the Americans consider themselves to be civilized and cultured when they're committing like murders and rapes and all these horrible things. And then, murders and rapes are committed upon them, so it's making a cultural dichotomy of, like, one culture considers itself civilized and they consider the other savage, but both cultures are savage. Granted, this is still a rather reactionary idea that everyone is savage. It's kind of a nihilistic, people are horrible message, and it's also just, it's taking, like, the idea that the indigenous peoples are savage sort of as default, as, like, for granted. Like, of course they are, but look at who else is savage, as opposed to saying, like, hey, maybe indigenous peoples, if they have any savagery, it's either because of their cultural background and we're putting our own Western judgment on it, or maybe it's even caused by Western influence in this area. So it's not the most woke commentary, but it is making a commentary about Western civilization specifically maybe not being as advanced and cultured as it wants to claim it is, because base human immorality still exists within it. So, and I sort of like that. I mean, that message is fairly on the surface of the movie, but because all of the other shock value stuff is so even more like in your face, a lot of people aren't bothering to examine that unless they're the people who normally would want to examine movies. But for the average, like, I don't know what the age is that people first decide to watch this movie or discover it. If I didn't see this movie till I was maybe 17, and I've known some people who have seen it at like 15. Shocking. If they're the kind of people who are like hardcore Fangoria readers and they grew up. Some of my contemporaries who grew up in the late 80s and the early to mid to even late 90s, who had access to these videos because they weren't banned at the time in like England or whatever, they got a little stayed by whatever the studios were putting out. There's only so many, like, what was horror doing in the early 90s? Jason Goes to Hell, Lord of Illusions. I mean, it wasn't doing anything near what, like, Cannibal Holocaust was doing. So eventually it was sort of like, those movies are kind of a gateway drug to these more extreme movies, and then you can decide whether it's just exploitation for the sake of exploitation or if it actually is quality. And in my opinion, this is a very good movie. I mean, it does what it wants to do. It wants to give you a pretty blatant social message, and it wants to shock you. And it wants to shock you about the cruel depths of human nature. And it does that. I mean, there are some people who will, see this video, or they know this is like, Cannibal Holocaust is nothing, Cannibal Ferox says this, or some other movie, some other August Underground or something has this. And I mean, yeah, there's always going to be a movie that pushes the envelope more. But whether it's gore for the sake of gore, or whether the gore is so extreme that it numbs you, or whether it actually has an effect, whether it actually can shock you, or whether it just throws a bunch of blood at the wall and see what sticks. is a little bit different. And to me, this is one of the extreme films that is also of quality. Because there are extreme movies. I mean, August Underground is fucking garbage. But it's extreme. So, I mean, extremity in and of itself does not make a movie either good or bad. It really just depends on what is the film trying to do, and is it successful at doing it. And are its goals pretty pedestrian, or is it reaching to do something? So, I think this is a pretty successful movie at what it's trying to do, and it's one of my favorite horror films because of how it balances the extremity. And it's also a building extremity. Things get worse and worse and worse, and that slow first half really sets up for that crackerjack second half. So that by the end of the movie, you feel kind of defeated by just the nihilistic cruelty of it all. And I really, really liked this movie. When I first saw it, it did sort of take me for a loop at just how negative it is about human nature. So, hey Carl, you back? So, this is one of the ones I'd recommend to people who want to see how far the horror genre can go, while still maintaining quality. So, let me talk a little bit about the making of this movie, or at least not so much the making, but what happened after it came out. So, the movie came out, and it was banned in Italy within days of it being released, mostly for the animal cruelty issue. But because it is this found footage thing, it's this movie within a movie, people actually thought this was really happening. They thought the actors actually died, and that the director was basically making a snuff film and that the actors were dead, that he killed the actors to make this movie. And as silly as that seems to sound. So the director was arrested, and he actually had to produce the actors and make them do interviews, and he had to actually bring schematics for how the special effects were done to prove that he didn't kill these people and that it's a fictitious film. And that is really funny. I mean, when Blair Witch came out, and Blair Witch was clearly at least somewhat influenced by this movie, even though its stylistic differences are vast. Bye, Carl. But all of the found footage genre was basically by this. I mean, people disappear or they die, and then footage is found, and we as the audience watch the footage and are supposed to be shocked. And when Blair Witch came out, people thought it was real. There were these fake documentaries on the Sci-Fi Channel. I remember there was a TV show on Bravo that used to look at independent films, and they presented the Blair Witch thing as if it was a real documentary that was being released at Sundance. And so it's not uncommon for people, before the found footage genre became this morass of garbage like The Gallows and stuff. Though I recently did watch Creep on Netflix, and Creep was pretty decent as far as found footage movies go, but in general, if you hear found footage these days, you're like, another fucking found footage. It's like every no-talent hack who wants to make a dirt-cheap horror movie makes found footage. It's just the easiest thing to do. And I liked the first 3 Paranormal Activity movies at least, and those were found footage, and those were probably the last big found footage hits. I mean, I guess I don't know if Gallows made a profit, but Gallows was fucking horrible. And then at this point we've gotten Quarantine and Wreck. We've gotten so many that the market has become saturated, and the genre needs something new with it. And so the genre has become something that just makes everyone groan as soon as they hear it's a found footage, whatever. I don't know. Oh yeah, the Poughkeepsie tapes, which I saw a few years ago from a pirated copy. It finally got an actual release on Blu-ray too. That's a fake documentary found footage movie. So that's maybe a bit more stylistically like Cannibal Holocaust, but not exactly. That was fairly decent. I have some issues with that movie, but anyway. But this Cannibal Holocaust was the film that really started that, where people think that the fictitious violence is something that happened and all of that. And yeah, Blair Witch was certainly the definite beneficiary of that when that was released in '99. And nowadays, if a found footage, nobody thinks any of these found footage movies are real anymore, no matter what they claim, whether it's Phoenix Forgotten or Unforgot, whatever the movie that was, the Blair Witch with Aliens ripoff, all these movies. So I guess if you hate found footage, and almost everyone hates found footage at this point, this is the movie to blame, but it's also the best found footage movie. I off the top of my head, I can't think of a better movie that uses this this approach. So that's Cannibal Holocaust. That's one of my favorite horror films. It's also the oldest movie I've done for Dave's Film Fave so far. Housekeeping. I had to rush to get the last Dave's Film Faves episodes up in time for Halloween. I just had a couple vacation days from my weekday job, so I was able to get a couple of these videos out in quick sequence. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer before the next Dave's Film Faves. I might do a couple of little videos in the meantime if I have time. I'm not sure, but I'm going to take a little bit of a little bit of a break right now from making YouTube videos. Some interesting, some good stuff happened in my professional life just recently, so I'm going to focus a little bit on that, and it's soon going to be November. I'll soon be done with the last class of getting my associates. I'll be a multiple degree holder at the end of the year, and at this point I'm coming up on like a year since all the shit with my ex happened, so I'm going to try and focus on my like love and personal life a little bit more in 2018. Maybe get a shitload of tattoos. I don't know. We'll see. But thanks for watching. I hope some of you have taken some movie recommendations and rented some stuff. Sorry that I get really spoilerific on these, but sometimes it's hard for me to explain how I like a movie if I don't explain where the movie ends up. Just one of my things. And I'll see you next time.